We're just using her until the house is finally ours, my daughter-in-law whispered in the kitchen at 11:47 that night, and my son laughed like she'd said something harmless. I stood in the dark hallway holding a mug of cold chamomile tea, listening to the two people I loved most speak about me like I was a piece of furniture waiting to be removed from the room. The light above the stove cast long shadows across the marble countertop Harold had installed with his own hands almost 20 years ago. He used to joke that he'd spent more time choosing that countertop than he had choosing his first car. I could still hear his laugh sometimes in the quiet parts of the house, especially late at night when the walls settled and the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loud enough to sound like footsteps. It had only been 12 days since we buried him. 12 days since I stood beside a polished oak casket wearing a black wool coat, while neighbors brought casseroles and whispered how sorry they were for my loss. At 69 years old, I thought grief would arrive like a storm. Loud, violent, obvious. Instead, it came quietly. It sat beside me at breakfast. It followed me through grocery store aisles. It stared at me from Harold's empty recliner every evening around 7 o'clock. But nothing hurt as much as hearing my own son say, "Just give it another month. She'll agree to sell once she realizes she can't manage this place alone." I pressed my fingers tighter around the mug to stop them from trembling. Vanessa laughed softly. "Honestly, Ethan, she should have moved years ago. Nobody needs a 5-bedroom house at her age." At her age, I used to hear women say those words about strangers. Never imagined one day they'd be used against me inside my own kitchen. I stayed perfectly still in the hallway, hidden between the dining room and the staircase, afraid even my breathing would betray me. Ethan opened the refrigerator, and the lights spilled across the hardwood floor. "Once we sell this place, we can finally clear the credit cards and put a down payment on the lake property." Vanessa lowered her voice again, but not enough. "We just have to keep being patient." With her. Patient with me. As if I were confused. Fragile. Temporary. I looked past the kitchen toward the family room, where Harold's reading glasses still rested beside his chair exactly where he'd left them the night before his heart attack. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I was visiting strangers who happened to own my memories. Earlier that evening, Vanessa had kissed my cheek and asked whether I wanted herbal tea before bed. Ethan had hugged me and called me Mom in that gentle voice he used whenever he wanted to sound caring. I realized then that kindness could sometimes be the cruelest performance of all. The floor creaked softly beneath me, and I froze, but the two of them kept talking. Vanessa began discussing real estate agents. Ethan mentioned assisted living communities with nice social programs. Every word landed softly and painfully, like snow covering a grave. Then Vanessa said something that hollowed out the last safe place inside my chest. "Honestly, she's easier to control now that Harold's gone." Silence filled my ears after that. Not anger, not tears, just silence. I slowly stepped backward into the darkness of the hallway and looked down at the small brass key resting in my palm. Harold had pressed it into my hand 3 months before he died and told me, "If anything ever feels wrong, open the box in the study." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Standing there outside the kitchen while my son planned my future like a business transaction, I finally understood why my husband had looked so worried the last few months of his life. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping softly against the bedroom windows. For a few disoriented seconds, I reached toward Harold's side of the bed expecting to feel the warmth of his shoulder beneath the blankets. My hand touched cold sheets instead. That was the cruel thing about grief. Every morning began with forgetting, and every morning punished you again for remembering. I sat up slowly and wrapped my pale blue robe tighter around myself while the house groaned quietly in the wind. Downstairs, I could already hear movement in the kitchen. Cabinet doors opening, coffee brewing. Vanessa always woke early when she wanted to appear productive. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, staring at the framed photograph on Harold's nightstand. We had taken it during a trip to Cape Cod 10 summers ago. Harold stood beside me wearing khaki shorts and a navy windbreaker, squinting against the sunlight with one arm around my waist. I remembered how tightly he had held me that day, as if he already knew time was running out faster than we realized. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stand. By the time I walked downstairs, Vanessa was arranging sliced strawberries on a ceramic plate like she was hosting a cooking show. Ethan sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone with a tired expression. Neither of them looked guilty. That surprised me most. After hearing what they said the night before, I expected awkwardness, nervousness, some sign they understood how cruel they had become. Instead, Vanessa smiled brightly the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Margaret. I made oatmeal if you want some." Her voice sounded sweet enough to belong to a church volunteer. I wondered how many lies could hide inside a smile before it stopped looking human. "Thank you," I said quietly, taking my usual seat beside the window. Ethan glanced up briefly. "Did you sleep okay, Mom?" I looked at him for a moment too long. His face still carried traces of the little boy who used to wait by the front door every evening for Harold to come home from work. Sometimes I forgot that children could grow into strangers while still wearing familiar faces. "I slept fine," I answered. Vanessa placed a steaming bowl in front of me, then immediately opened her laptop across the counter. A real estate website reflected in her glasses. She noticed me looking and quickly minimized the screen. "Just browsing decorating ideas," she said lightly. I nodded as if I believed her. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows overlooking the backyard. Harold had planted those maple trees himself 15 years ago. Every autumn, he raked the leaves into giant piles for Ethan, even after Ethan became too old to jump into them. Harold never stopped trying to create memories for our family. That was the tragedy of good men. They spent their whole lives building homes for people who rarely appreciated the cost. Breakfast passed in strained politeness. Vanessa talked about grocery prices and weather forecasts while Ethan answered emails between bites of toast. I noticed he barely looked at me anymore. The silence between us had changed shape since Harold died. It no longer felt sad. It felt deliberate. After breakfast, I carried my bowl to the sink, but Vanessa stepped forward quickly. "Oh no, Margaret, let me do that. You should rest." Rest. Another word people used when they had already decided your useful years were over. I dried my hands carefully on a dish towel and watched Ethan grab his car keys from the counter. "You heading to the office?" I asked. He hesitated. "Actually, Vanessa and I are meeting someone about a possible investment opportunity." Vanessa glanced toward him so quickly I almost missed it. A warning hidden inside a marriage look. "Nothing serious," she added. "Just planning for the future." Planning for the future. Their future, not mine. The front door closed behind them a few minutes later, leaving the house unnaturally quiet again. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the grandfather clock tick from the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded louder now that Harold was gone, as if time itself had become impatient. My eyes drifted toward the study at the end of the hall. Harold's study had remained untouched since the funeral. His leather chair still angled toward the bookshelf. His reading lamp still plugged into the wall beside the desk. And somewhere inside that room was the locked box Harold warned me about 3 months before he died. I reached into the pocket of my robe and wrapped my fingers around the small brass key again. This time, instead of fear, I felt something colder settle quietly inside me. Clarity. The hallway felt colder as I walked toward Harold's study, though the thermostat still read 72 degrees. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows, and somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked beneath the weight of an empty room. I paused outside the study door, with my hand resting against the brass knob. For 12 days, I had avoided this room completely. Neighbors brought sympathy cards. Church friends delivered casseroles wrapped in foil. Ethan handled funeral paperwork, while Vanessa rearranged flower arrangements around the living room like grief was another social event to coordinate. Through all of it, I never stepped inside Harold's study. The door had remained closed like a final breath neither of us was ready to release. But now the silence inside that room felt different. Heavy. Waiting. I pushed the door open slowly. The familiar scent of cedarwood and old paper greeted me immediately. Harold always kept the windows cracked open no matter the season, because he claimed fresh air helped him think clearly. His desk lamp still cast a soft amber glow across stacks of neatly organized folders because I had forgotten to unplug it after the funeral. For one painful second, I could almost imagine him sitting there wearing his reading glasses low on his nose while muttering about baseball scores or property taxes. My chest tightened so sharply I had to grip the edge of the bookshelf to steady myself. Grief was strange that way. One moment you felt almost normal. The next, a scent or shadow could split you wide open. I walked carefully across the room, my slippers brushing softly against the Persian rug Harold bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Boston. The desk looked untouched except for one thing. A navy blue legal envelope rested near the corner beside Harold's fountain pen. I frowned. I had not noticed it before. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up. Written across the front in Harold's careful handwriting were 4 simple words. For Margaret, if needed. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before sliding one finger beneath the seal. Inside was a folded letter and a smaller white card with the logo of a law office printed across the top. Whitmore and Kane Estate Attorneys. Harold's attorney. A cold feeling settled quietly into my stomach. I unfolded the letter first. Margaret, if you are reading this, then something inside this house no longer feels safe to you. I stopped, breathing for a moment. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance while rain streaked across the windows behind me. Harold's handwriting remained steady across the page, calm and precise exactly like the man himself. Over the past year, I have noticed changes in Ethan that worry me deeply. Financial pressure changes people, especially when pride is involved. Vanessa encourages his worst instincts because she sees this house as an opportunity instead of a home. I lowered the letter slowly, my eyes burning. Harold knew. Somehow my husband had seen everything before I did. I sat down carefully in his leather chair and continued reading. I did not tell you sooner because I hoped I was wrong. I hoped grief, stress, and debt were clouding my judgment. But if you ever feel pushed aside inside your own home, contact Daniel Whitmore immediately before making any decisions. The documents are secured. Trust yourself, Maggie. You have always been stronger than you believe. Tears blurred the ink for the first time since the funeral. Not loud sobbing. Just silent tears slipping down my face while the grandfather clock echoed through the hallway outside. Harold used to call me Maggie whenever he wanted to remind me who I was before motherhood consumed every corner of my life. Before school lunches and soccer practices and mortgage payments turned me into someone who always placed herself last. I looked down at the white card from the law office again. On the back, Harold had written a second note in smaller handwriting. The key opens the bottom drawer. My hand instinctively moved toward the brass key still tucked inside my robe pocket. Slowly, I turned toward Harold's desk. The bottom drawer looked ordinary enough, polished mahogany with a brass handle worn slightly dull from years of use. But when I inserted the key and heard the quiet click of the lock releasing, I realized my husband had not spent the last months of his life preparing for death. He had spent them preparing to protect me. Inside the drawer sat 3 thick folders, a leather checkbook, and a sealed manila envelope with my name written across the front in Harold's handwriting. The rain outside had softened into a steady drizzle, and the quiet inside the study felt almost sacred now, like the room itself had been waiting patiently for me to finally understand something important. I reached for the first folder and opened it carefully across Harold's desk. Property records, trust documents, bank statements. Everything organized with the same precision Harold used for 42 years of marriage and 38 years running his construction company. Harold believed paperwork could prevent chaos if you kept it in the right order. At the time, I used to tease him about it. Sitting there alone in his study while my son quietly planned to take this house from me, I suddenly felt grateful for every labeled folder and every careful signature. The first document that caught my attention was dated 8 months earlier. Holloway Family Property Trust. I frowned and adjusted my reading glasses. My eyes moved slowly across the legal language until one sentence forced me to stop completely. Upon the death of Harold Benjamin Holloway, sole ownership of the residence located at 114 Willow Creek Drive shall transfer immediately and exclusively to Margaret Elaine Holloway. I read the sentence again, then a third time. Sole ownership, exclusively to me. My fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. Ethan's name appeared nowhere. Neither did Vanessa's. A second document sat beneath it. Restrictions and protections regarding forced property sale. Harold had protected the house so thoroughly that no one could pressure me into selling it without my direct written authorization. Not family, not creditors, no one. I leaned back slowly in Harold's chair, stunned by the quiet magnitude of what he had done. All these weeks, Ethan and Vanessa had spoken as though this house already belonged to them. They discussed renovations, market value, selling timelines. They acted like I was an obstacle standing between them and their future. But legally, They had nothing. Not a single brick. Not a single inch of hardwood flooring beneath their feet. A strange feeling spread through my chest then. Not relief exactly. Something steadier. Like standing upright after weeks of stumbling. Through fog. I opened the second folder next. Credit reports. Copies of overdue notices. Several highlighted bank statements. At first, the numbers meant nothing to me. Then I saw Ethan's name attached to nearly $68,000 in credit card debt. My stomach tightened. Ethan had always been terrible with money, even when he was young. At 16, he spent an entire summer paycheck on expensive speakers for his car, instead of saving for college textbooks. Harold used to shake his head and say, "That boy thinks tomorrow will always pay for today." But this was different. This was drowning. Several payments had been marked late. One account carried interest so high it looked impossible to recover from. Then I saw Vanessa's handwriting across one printed budget sheet. House sale solves everything. I stared at the sentence until the letters blurred together. Not helps. Not supports. Solves everything. The house was never sentimental to them. It was arithmetic. A transaction. A lifeboat built from Harold's death and my loneliness. I closed the folder slowly and rubbed my fingers against my temple. Somewhere upstairs, a vacuum cleaner suddenly started running. Vanessa. They must have come home without me hearing the garage door open. I remained perfectly still in Harold's chair while the distant hum moved across the second-floor hallway. For the first time since the funeral, I understood why Harold looked so exhausted during those final months. It was not only illness wearing him down. It was worry. He had spent the end of his life trying to protect me from the very people we raised and welcomed into this family. My eyes drifted toward the sealed manila envelope still resting unopened beside the folders. Carefully, I slid one finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single handwritten page and a business card for Daniel Whitmore. "Maggie, if things have reached the point where you needed to open this drawer, then I need you to remember something very important. Being kind does not mean allowing yourself to be used." I swallowed hard. Harold's handwriting dipped slightly lower on the page, weaker than normal near the end. "Ethan is our son, and I love him. Deeply. But love does not excuse selfishness. Promise me you will not sacrifice your peace just to keep others comfortable." I lowered the paper slowly into my lap, while the vacuum cleaner continued moving overhead. Back and forth. Back and forth. Cleaning rooms Vanessa probably already imagined decorating after I was gone. For the first time in 12 days, I did not feel like the grieving widow trapped inside this house. I felt like its owner. That evening, Vanessa insisted on making dinner herself. She moved around the kitchen with exaggerated cheerfulness, humming softly while opening cabinets and setting plates on the counter. Anyone visiting our home would have thought she was a devoted daughter-in-law caring for a grieving widow. I stood near the stove peeling carrots slowly, watching her from the corner of my eye while pretending nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Once you learn the truth about someone, even ordinary conversations begin sounding rehearsed. Ethan arrived home just after 6 carrying a paper bag from an expensive bakery downtown. "Thought dessert might cheer everyone up," he said with a tired smile. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek and avoided looking directly at me. I noticed that now. The guilt lived in tiny places. In shortened eye contact. In overly polite voices. In the way Ethan suddenly spoke to me like a fragile neighbor instead of his mother. Dinner was roasted chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes served on the china Harold and I bought during our first anniversary. Vanessa lit 2 candles in the center of the table, their soft glow reflecting against crystal glasses while rain tapped quietly against the dining room windows again. The scene looked warm enough to belong on a holiday card. But grief had taught me something important. Some of the loneliest moments in life happen while sitting at a full table. "I was thinking," Vanessa said lightly while passing the potatoes, "this house probably feels overwhelming now that it is just the 3 of us." I kept my expression calm and spooned gravy onto my plate. "It is a large house," I admitted quietly. Ethan relaxed slightly at my response. I could almost see hope returning to his face. Vanessa leaned forward with carefully measured concern. "Exactly. Too much maintenance. Too many stairs. Honestly, Margaret, you deserve somewhere easier. Somewhere peaceful. Somewhere easier." The phrases sounded polished, practiced, like lines repeated in private before being presented to me over candlelight and roast chicken. "We actually toured a really beautiful senior community last week," Ethan added carefully. It has walking trails, gardening clubs, private dining rooms. You would probably love it. Probably. I looked down at my plate for a moment before answering. That was thoughtful of you. Vanessa smiled immediately, mistaking my calmness for surrender. We are only thinking about what is best for you. No, I thought silently. You are thinking about square footage, about mortgage payments, about debt collectors and lake houses and fresh starts built from my husband's death. But I only nodded softly and continued eating. The less I reacted, the more comfortable they became. And comfortable people reveal everything eventually. After dinner, Ethan carried dishes into the kitchen while Vanessa poured herself a glass of white wine. I excused myself quietly and walked toward the downstairs powder room near the hallway. Halfway there, their voices drifted from the kitchen behind me. See, Vanessa whispered. I told you she is finally accepting it. Ethan sounded uncertain. I still feel bad. Vanessa lowered her voice further, but years of motherhood had trained me to hear conversations no one intended me to catch. Feeling bad will not fix $68,000 of debt, Ethan. Silence followed. Then the clink of a wine glass against marble. Once she moves out, we can refinance everything. This house changes our lives. I stood perfectly still beside the dark hallway while the grandfather clock ticked softly nearby. Tick, tick, tick. Harold's favorite clock. The same one Ethan used to hide behind during childhood games of hide and seek. Funny how memory worked. A house could hold decades of laughter while quietly sheltering betrayal at the same time. Ethan spoke again, his voice lower now. I just do not want her finding out we already spoke to a realtor. Vanessa laughed softly. By the time she realizes what is happening, the paperwork will already be moving. Paperwork. That word again. As if my life could be folded neatly into legal envelopes and quietly removed from existence. I stepped silently back toward the dining room before they noticed me listening. My hands felt strangely steady now. Not numb. Not angry. Steady. Earlier that afternoon, I had memorized Daniel Whitmore's phone number from Harold's business card. At the time, I told myself I might call in a few days after thinking everything through carefully. But standing there in the dim dining room while my son discussed my future like a scheduling inconvenience, I realized something important. Harold did not leave those documents for me to mourn over. He left them for me to use. Upstairs, floorboards creaked as Ethan climbed toward the bedroom he and Vanessa now occupied at the end of the hall. My bedroom remained downstairs beside Harold's empty closet and folded sweaters that still smelled faintly like cedarwood and aftershave. I sat quietly at the dining table long after the dishes were washed and the house settled into silence again. Then, finally, I reached for my phone. It was 9:42 at night when I dialed Daniel Whitmore's number. Daniel Whitmore answered on the third ring with the tired but steady voice of a man who had spent decades listening to family secrets after business hours. Mrs. Holloway, he said gently after I introduced myself. I was wondering when you might call. I sat alone at the dining room table with only the small lamp near the china cabinet glowing softly against the darkness. Upstairs, faint footsteps crossed the hallway ceiling above me before settling into silence. Ethan and Vanessa were getting ready for bed, while downstairs I quietly discovered the life Harold had been protecting for me all along. You knew? I asked softly. Daniel paused for a moment. Your husband was a very careful man. He asked me to watch out for you if anything ever felt wrong after his passing. The word passing still sounded unnatural to me. Too clean. Too small for the disappearance of a 42-year marriage. I stared at the untouched wine glass Vanessa left beside the sink earlier that evening. Everything feels wrong, I admitted quietly. Daniel did not sound surprised. He asked if I could meet him privately the next morning at his office downtown. Bring the folders from Harold's desk, he said. And Margaret, do not discuss any of this with Ethan yet. Yet. Such a simple word carrying so much weight. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence for several minutes while rainwater slid down the windows in silver streaks beneath the porch light outside. My reflection looked older than I remembered. The grief had hollowed my cheeks slightly, and silver strands framed my face where I had forgotten to color my hair these past few months. But there was something else in my reflection now too. Awareness. I finally understood that mourning Harold and protecting myself were no longer separate things. The next morning, I left the house just after 8 carrying Harold's leather folder tucked carefully beneath my arm. Vanessa stood in the kitchen wearing cream-colored yoga clothes while stirring artificial sweetener into her coffee. "You are up early," she said brightly. "Just running errands," I replied. Ethan barely looked up from his phone. "Need me to drive you anywhere, Mom?" The question sounded polite, but something underneath it felt watchful. "No, thank you," I answered calmly. "I still remember how to drive." Vanessa laughed softly as though I had made a charming joke instead of reminding them I was not helpless. Outside, the air smelled fresh from last night's storm. Harold's old Lincoln sat in the driveway beneath droplets of water that glimmered in the morning sunlight. He used to wash this car every Sunday afternoon while listening to Frank Sinatra through a portable radio balanced on the garage shelf. I rested my hand against the hood for a brief second before climbing inside. Downtown Maplewood looked unchanged despite the quiet collapse happening inside my family. Coffee shops opened for morning customers. Delivery trucks unloaded boxes onto sidewalks. A young couple walked hand in hand past the courthouse laughing about something ordinary and temporary. Grief always felt strange in public because the world refused to slow down alongside your heartbreak. Daniel Whitmore's office occupied the third floor of an old red brick building overlooking Main Street. The waiting room smelled faintly like leather chairs and brewed coffee. Framed photographs of local charity events lined the walls beside degrees from Yale and Columbia. Harold trusted Daniel because he believed good attorneys should look boring enough to underestimate. Daniel himself appeared exactly as I remembered. Mid-60s, silver hair, calm blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted me warmly and guided me into his office overlooking the courthouse clock tower. "How much do Ethan and Vanessa know?" he asked once the door closed. "Enough to think this house already belongs to them," I answered quietly. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had expected. He opened Harold's folders carefully across the desk and reviewed each document while I watched sunlight creep across the carpet between us. Finally, he folded his hands together. "Margaret, legally speaking, the house is fully protected. Harold transferred everything exactly 6 months ago." Relief washed through me briefly before another question surfaced. "Then why would Ethan act like this?" Daniel looked down for a moment before answering carefully. "Because desperation changes people. Your husband discovered significant financial issues involving Ethan nearly a year ago. Credit cards, business loans, missed payments. Harold believed Vanessa was pressuring him heavily." I closed my eyes briefly. Hearing it spoken aloud made the betrayal feel painfully real. Daniel slid another folder toward me. "There is something else you need to know." Inside were printed emails between Ethan and a real estate agent discussing estimated listing prices for my home dated 2 weeks before Harold's funeral. My fingers went cold against the paper. 2 weeks before the funeral. Before Harold was even buried. They were already planning what to do with my house. Daniel watched my expression carefully. "Your husband feared this exact situation," he said quietly, "which is why he prepared another option for you if staying there ever became impossible." I looked up slowly. "What option?" Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Harold authorized the immediate private sale of the property whenever you decide you are ready." For a moment, I could not speak. Outside Daniel Whitmore's office window, traffic moved slowly through downtown Maplewood while sunlight reflected against storefront glass across Main Street. Ordinary people carried shopping bags, crossed intersections, drank coffee on outdoor patios. None of them knew that a widow sitting quietly on the third floor of a law office had just realized her husband prepared an escape route before he died. "A private sale?" I repeated softly. Daniel nodded. "Harold wanted to make sure you would never feel trapped inside that house if the family situation became unhealthy." Unhealthy. Such a careful word for betrayal. Daniel opened another folder and slid several documents toward me. "A private buyer Harold trusted has remained interested in the property for over a year. Cash purchase. No public listing. Fast closing if necessary." I stared down at the paperwork while my heartbeat echoed steadily inside my chest. Sell the house. Leave everything behind. The idea should have terrified me. Instead, something unexpected settled over me. Peace. Not complete peace, but the first fragile piece of it I had felt since Harold died. Daniel watched me carefully. "You do not need to decide today." But I already understood something he did not yet realize. The decision had begun the moment I overheard Ethan and Vanessa speaking about me like I was a temporary inconvenience standing between them and financial freedom. I thought about Ethan at 6 years old sitting on Harold's shoulders during 4th of July parades. I thought about teenage Ethan sleeping on our couch after his first heartbreak while I rubbed his back until sunrise. Mothers spend decades believing love alone can protect a family from becoming strangers. Sometimes we are wrong. What happens if I sell? I asked quietly. Daniel folded his hands together. The proceeds transfer entirely to your trust account. Ethan and Vanessa would receive nothing. Unless you chose otherwise. Nothing. The word sat heavily between us. Not because they deserved the money, but because once this happened, there would be no pretending anymore. No family illusion left standing. Daniel must have seen something shift across my face because his voice softened slightly. Margaret, protecting yourself is not cruelty. I looked down at Harold's signature across the trust documents. Bold. Certain. He had known me well enough to understand this would be the hardest part for me. Not losing the house. Losing the version of Ethan I kept trying to remember instead of the man he had become. By the time I returned home that afternoon, clouds had cleared completely and sunlight stretched across the driveway in long golden lines. Ethan's SUV sat parked beside Harold's Lincoln. Through the front window, I could see Vanessa arranging flowers in the living room while talking animatedly on her phone. She looked comfortable, confident, like someone already imagining where to place her own furniture. I stepped inside quietly. Vanessa turned immediately with a bright smile. Margaret, there you are. Ethan was worried when you were gone so long. Worried. Another polished word hiding control beneath concern. Traffic downtown was terrible. I replied calmly while removing my coat. Ethan appeared from the kitchen carrying a bottle of water. You should probably text next time, Mom. We just want to make sure you are okay. I studied his face for a moment. He really believed this performance still worked. That was the saddest part. Somewhere between debt and desperation, my son had convinced himself manipulation counted as care if spoken gently enough. I appreciate that, I said softly. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. Did you get your errands done? For half a second, I considered telling them everything. The trust, the documents, the fact that Harold protected every inch of this house from their plans. But then I remembered the real estate emails dated before Harold's funeral. I remembered Vanessa saying I was easier to control now that my husband was gone. So instead, I smiled faintly and said, almost. That evening, Ethan ordered takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant downtown. Vanessa opened a bottle of wine and suggested we watch an old movie together in the family room, like old times. They were trying harder now. Softer voices, longer smiles, more careful kindness. Fear was beginning to creep beneath their confidence because they sensed something changing even if they did not yet understand what it was. During the movie, Vanessa rested her head against Ethan's shoulder while casually scrolling through home renovation photos on her phone. She forgot to angle the screen away from me this time. White kitchens, marble islands, expanded master suites. My house already transformed into their future. Around 10 o'clock, I excused myself and went upstairs. Instead of changing into pajamas immediately, I walked slowly down the hallway toward the guest bedroom overlooking the backyard. Harold used to call it the quiet room because sunlight always reached it first in the morning. I stood beside the window watching tree branches sway gently beneath the porch lights below. Then, finally, I made my decision. I reached into my robe pocket, removed Daniel Whitmore's business card, and quietly dialed his number again. When he answered, I did not hesitate this time. Daniel, I said calmly, I am ready to sell the house. The private sale moved faster than I expected. Daniel Whitmore handled everything quietly over the next 4 days while Ethan and Vanessa continued moving through the house as though it already belonged to them. That was the strange thing about deception. People became careless once they convinced themselves they had already won. By Thursday afternoon, every document had been signed electronically except the final closing papers waiting at Daniel's office downtown. The buyer was a retired physician from Connecticut who wanted the property for his daughter and her family. Cash offer. 30-day transition period. No public listing. No open house. No realtor signs planted in the yard. Harold truly had prepared every detail long before his death. Meanwhile, inside the house, Vanessa grew increasingly comfortable discussing plans that no longer included me. That evening she stood in the kitchen, flipping through paint samples while Ethan scrolled renovation estimates on his tablet. I think lighter walls would open up the family room, she said casually. And we should definitely remove those floral curtains Margaret likes. She said my name the way people mention outdated furniture scheduled for removal. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. The kitchen needs a full remodel eventually. Eventually. I stirred sugar slowly into my tea while listening to them redesign my home around me. The chandelier above the dining table reflected softly against the polished wood Harold refinished by hand nearly 15 years ago. Every inch of this house carried his fingerprints somewhere beneath the paint and plaster. But Ethan no longer saw memories when he looked around these rooms. He saw market value. Vanessa finally looked toward me with a bright smile. We are just brainstorming ideas. Nothing serious. I returned a small smile of my own. Of course. Upstairs later that night, I opened Harold's closet for the first time since the funeral. His navy wool coats still hung perfectly spaced beside pressed button-down shirts arranged by color exactly as he preferred. The scent of cedarwood drifted faintly from the shelves. I reached out and brushed my fingertips across one jacket sleeve before carefully removing the old silver watch Harold wore almost every day for 30 years. The leather band had softened with age, and tiny scratches marked the edges from decades of construction sites and family vacations and ordinary mornings drinking coffee beside me at the breakfast table. I fastened the watch around my wrist slowly. I hope I am doing the right thing, I whispered into the quiet room. The house answered with silence. But for the first time since Harold died, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt protective somehow, like he had already anticipated this moment and left pieces of himself behind to guide me through it. The next morning, Daniel called just after 9. Everything is finalized, he said calmly. The funds have already transferred into your trust account. I closed my eyes briefly. It was done. 42 years of marriage. 38 years inside this house. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. School pictures taped to the refrigerator. Harold dancing with me barefoot in the kitchen one summer night after too much wine. All of it legally belonged to someone else now. Strangely, I did not feel heartbreak. I felt lighter. That afternoon, Ethan and Vanessa left to tour another senior living community they wanted me to see over the weekend. Vanessa kissed my cheek before leaving. You are going to love this place, she promised warmly. They even have watercolor classes. I smiled gently and wished them a nice afternoon. The moment their SUV disappeared down Willow Creek Drive, I called Daniel again. What happens next? I asked quietly. Tomorrow morning at 10, he replied. The buyer and his attorney will arrive at the house with the final possession documents. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. And Ethan? Daniel paused carefully before answering. Legally, they are entitled to the transition period outlined in the agreement. But they will need to understand immediately that ownership has changed. Ownership has changed. Such a clean sentence for something that would shatter my son's illusion completely. That evening, Ethan brought home expensive takeout from a steakhouse downtown, while Vanessa opened champagne to celebrate what she called fresh starts. The irony almost made me laugh. They spent dinner discussing future renovation possibilities while I quietly folded my napkin beside untouched mashed potatoes. At one point, Vanessa lifted her champagne glass toward me. To family, she said sweetly. I looked at my son sitting beside her. The same little boy who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a butterfly in our backyard. Somewhere over the years, fear and greed and weakness had hollowed something important out of him. But despite everything, I still loved him. That was the hardest part. To family, I echoed softly. Later that night, after the house finally settled into darkness, I sat alone in Harold's recliner wearing his silver watch while moonlight stretched across the living room floor. The grandfather clock struck midnight softly from the hallway. In less than 10 hours, everything inside this house would change forever. At 9:58 the next morning, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house with a strange finality, like the last note of a song played too softly to notice until it ended. I was already dressed and waiting in the living room wearing a cream sweater, dark slacks, and Harold's silver watch resting against my wrist. Sunlight poured through the front windows, illuminating dust particles drifting lazily through the air while the grandfather clock ticked steadily beside the staircase. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa blow-drying her hair. Ethan was still in the shower. For one quiet moment, I almost pitied them. Daniel Whitmore stood outside beside a tall, gray-haired man in a navy overcoat carrying a leather briefcase. Behind them, A dark sedan sat parked near the curb beneath the maple trees Harold planted years ago. "Good morning, Margaret," Daniel said gently as I opened the door. "This is Dr. Alan Mercer." The man offered a polite handshake and a respectful smile. "Your home is beautiful," he said sincerely. Home, not property, not investment. The word eased something inside my chest. I invited them into the dining room, where final paperwork already waited neatly arranged across the polished table. Harold used to host Thanksgiving dinners there every year while arguing playfully about football scores and overcooked stuffing recipes. Strange how a room could hold joy and heartbreak without changing shape at all. Daniel began reviewing documents calmly, while Dr. Mercer signed several forms with efficient professionalism. Everything felt surprisingly ordinary considering my entire life was shifting beneath my feet. At exactly 10:14, footsteps sounded overhead, followed by Vanessa's voice drifting casually from the upstairs hallway. "Ethan, who is here?" Neither Daniel nor I answered immediately. A few seconds later, Vanessa appeared at the staircase wearing white linen pants and holding a coffee mug. The moment she saw strangers seated at the dining table, her smile vanished. "What is going on?" she asked sharply. Ethan came downstairs behind her, still buttoning his shirt sleeves. Confusion crossed his face. First, then concern, then something darker once he noticed the paperwork spread across the table. "Mom," he said slowly. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "Sit down, Ethan." Vanessa remained standing. "Why are attorneys here?" Daniel Whitmore removed his glasses carefully and placed them atop the documents. "As of this morning, ownership of this property has officially transferred to Dr. Mercer." Silence filled the room instantly. Ethan blinked once like he had misheard the sentence entirely. Vanessa laughed softly at first, confused. "Transferred?" she repeated. "What does that mean?" Daniel's voice remained calm and professional. "Margaret executed a private sale agreement earlier this week." Ethan turned toward me, so quickly his chair nearly struck the hardwood floor. "You sold the house." The disbelief in his voice hurt more than anger would have. Not because he loved the home, but because he truly never imagined I would act before they could control the situation themselves. Vanessa's face drained of color. "No," she whispered sharply. "No, there has to be some mistake." Daniel slid a folder gently across the table toward Ethan. "There is no mistake. Legally, the property belonged solely to Margaret Holloway following Harold Holloway's passing." Ethan stared at the documents without touching them. "Dad left the house to Mom?" The sadness in his voice almost broke me then, because beneath the greed and weakness, I finally heard the frightened little boy he used to be. Vanessa recovered first. She stepped toward the table with sudden urgency. "You cannot do this to us," she said, her polished sweetness cracking apart completely now. "We live here." I looked up at her quietly. "Actually, Vanessa, I already did." The room fell silent again except for the grandfather clock ticking steadily from the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Ethan sank slowly into his chair while rubbing both hands across his face. "Mom," he whispered painfully, "why would you not talk to me first?" I held his gaze for a long moment. "Because I heard you talking about me first." His eyes widened slightly. Vanessa looked away immediately. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to explain. The betrayal had already happened long before this morning. The paperwork simply forced everyone to stop pretending otherwise. Daniel finally cleared his throat gently. "The agreement includes a 30-day transition period." Dr. Mercer nodded respectfully. "I am in no rush. I simply ask for honesty and cooperation." Ethan looked exhausted suddenly. Older somehow. Vanessa remained frozen beside the staircase, clutching her untouched coffee mug with trembling fingers. I stood slowly from the table and smoothed my sweater sleeves. "I have already arranged somewhere else to stay," I said quietly. Ethan stared up at me in shock. "You are leaving?" I glanced around the dining room one last time. Sunlight across polished wood. Family photographs lining the hallway. Harold's clock still ticking faithfully beside the stairs. For weeks after his death, this house felt haunted by grief. But standing there now, I realized something important. The grief was never the thing destroying me. Betrayal was. I picked up my purse carefully and rested one hand against Harold's silver watch before walking toward the front door. Behind me, no one tried to stop me. And for the first time since Harold died, the silence no longer hurt at all.